everyone and welcome back to my channel. On today's video I'm going to show you the month of Ramadan preparations part 2, it's sweets and desserts edition. And I already made part 1 where I showed you how to freeze veggies, meats and pastries. So don't forget to go ahead and check that one too. I'm going to put the link down below the video in the description box. Don't forget to follow me on social media and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And now let's start. First I'm going to start with the atayef. Now I have a small batch here and I want to freeze it. So on a cling film, as you can see, I put some atayef and I'm covering it with another piece of cling film. I'm also going to put some atayef and so on. And the purpose here is to separate the atayef so that they don't stick to each other when they're frozen. So I'm going to continue to do so until I finish all of the atayef, separating them with some cling film. And after that I'm going to put them all together in a Ziploc bag. I'm going to close it tightly and then I'm going to place it in the freezer, and whenever I want some atayef, I just grab and defrost the quantity that I want. It saves me some time. Now let's move on to the stuffed atayef. Now you can freeze stuffed atayef if they're filled with cheese or walnuts. So if I have a small quantity, I just place them in a Ziploc bag. Of course, to make sure that they are separated so that they don't stick to each other. And you just want to close them tightly and place them in the freezer. Of course, don't forget to write on the bag what's in it and the date of storing. Now if you have a bigger batch and you want to freeze it, just place them on a tray lined with some cling film. Of course, you want to place them separated from each other, and you want to cover them again with some cling film and place them in the freezer so that each one freezes on its own. After that, you can put them all together in one bag. And even though they are touching each other, that's okay. They won't stick to each other because each piece is separately frozen. Now let's move on to the fine kunafa dough. I made a batch here that makes me 2 trays, medium sized. And to freeze them, all I'm gonna do is to divide them in some Ziploc bags. I'm gonna divide them equally. And then I'm gonna close the bags tightly and store them in the freezer. And by the way, they freeze very well because the granules stay separated from each other. They don't freeze as one big piece, and that's great, of course. So whenever you want to make kunafa, you just grab the bag from the freezer and you can start working with it right away. Now of course, don't forget to write on the bag what's inside of it and the date of storing. And by the way, they stay in the freezer from 2 to 3 months. Now let's move on to the other kind of kunafa dough. As you can see here, they look like noodles. Now to store them, simply as before, I'm gonna place them in a Ziploc bag, and I'm gonna place each batch in a bag. For example, one batch will make me 1 tray of kunafa, and I'm gonna close tightly the bag and place it in the freezer. Now this kind of dough usually stick to each other when they're frozen, so when you want to use it, you want to defrost it for about 1 hour. Just put it on the counter at room temperature and then use it. Now let's move on to the ashta. I have a homemade batch here. Now ashta can't be frozen, but it can be stored in the fridge for about 3 to 5 days. So here I'm just going to put it in an airtight container. I'm going to spread it evenly. I'm also going to cover it with a cling film. And you want the cling film to touch the surface of the ashta so that it doesn't form a layer in the fridge. And just simply close it tightly and store it in the fridge for whenever you want to use it. It stays good for about 3 to 5 days. Now let's move on to my dried fruits tray. Now in the month of Ramadan, I like having my dried fruits ready and on hand. So as you can see here, I have a tray that has 6 compartments. And I'm gonna put in it different kinds of dried fruits. I have some dates, pistachios, raisins, walnuts, almonds, and some dried apricots. First of all, it looks very beautiful. Second, they're ready for you on iftar and on suhoor. They're really good for you and loaded with vitamins. Of course, the pistachios and the almonds, I have them here unsalted. Now, of course, you want to keep them covered all the time so that they stay fresh for a longer period of time. And sometimes what I like to do is to grab a piece of apricot, open it, and put in it a piece of almond. The same thing for the dates. I like to fill my date with a piece of walnut or almond. It's a nice and yummy idea for suhoor if you don't have time. So for me, that's really necessary. Now for storing crushed nuts, I usually like to crush my nuts by myself. I don't like to buy them already ground. And we use lots of crushed nuts in Middle Eastern desserts. So I have here some almonds, pistachios, walnuts, and some coconut. Now for the coconut, I usually buy it shredded. But for the rest of the nuts, I usually grind them myself. And simply, I just put them in my food processor. Of course, each one on its own. And I process until I have a smooth texture. Now the pistachios and the almonds here are unsalted, of course. Now when you're processing the nuts, you don't want to over process. Otherwise, the oils of the nuts start to come out. And you'll have like pistachio butter or almond butter. And of course, you don't want that here. And for the coconuts, I usually buy it unsweetened. Now all you want to do is to store them in airtight containers so that they stay fresh for a longer period of time. And you can use them anytime you want, when you're making desserts. And that saves you some time. Now let's move on to prepare some desserts dry mixes. Now some of the Middle Eastern desserts like sfouf or basbousa can be partially prepared ahead of time by preparing the dry mix and store it in an airtight container. So I have here the dry ingredients of sfouf. I'm just gonna mix them all together. I have the semolina, the flour, the sugar, the baking powder, the salt, and the turmeric. And I'm just gonna mix them very well until everything's well combined. And then I'm gonna store it in an airtight container. And whenever I wanna make sfouf, I just add the wet ingredients, which are the milk and the oil, mix and bake. Of course, don't forget to write on the jar or on the container the name of the dessert and the quantity of the wet ingredients that you're gonna add. I'm also gonna do the same with my basbousa. I'm gonna add all the dry ingredients together and give it a good mix. And just store the dry ingredients in an airtight container for whenever I want to make basbousa. Now I'm going to do the same for my eggless chocolate cake. So I'm mixing together the sugar, the cocoa powder, the flour, the baking soda, baking powder, and salt. And I'm going to mix everything together very well until everything is well combined. And I'm going to store it in an airtight container for whenever I want to make chocolate cake. Now all my dry mixes are ready to be stored. Don't forget to write on them the name of the dessert and the quantity of the wet ingredients that you're gonna add. Now let's move on to storing some pastry doughs. So I have here some phyllo pastry and some butter puff pastry. I love having them on hand because I can use them with so many desserts. Now of course you can make them at home and store them in the freezer, but making them at home takes time and effort. So personally I prefer to buy them. And this is the phyllo pastry. It comes rolled out like that. It's like very thin sheets. You can use them for baklava and so many different desserts and savory dishes too. And the same thing for puff pastry. It has lots of buttery layers and I love having it on hand. I can make with it apple turnovers, palmier, my tomato tarts. It's very handy. To me, I have to have it in the freezer. Also, you can make it at home and freeze it, but personally I prefer to buy them because they save me so much time and effort. Now finally, I'm gonna store some simple syrup. I'm just gonna place it in an airtight container. Of course, when I prepared it, I let it cool completely before storing it. And that way it's ready to be used whenever I want to make some desserts. That calls for simple syrup. Now, when you are making simple syrup, you want to add some lemon juice so that it doesn't crystallize and stores beautifully. And of course, you just store it at room temperature and it stays up to 2 months. So that was it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I also hope that you find it useful and helpful for you. Don't forget to go ahead and watch the part 2 of the month of Ramadan preparations from A to Z. I'm gonna link it down below the video. And before I finish, I just wanna tell you Ramadan Mubarak for you and your loved ones. And I'm gonna see you soon in another video. Bye!